They truly believed I returned to beg for scraps of their affection, mistaking my silence for weakness and my solitude for shame. But when the truth finally walked through those ballroom doors, their laughter stopped forever. Sometimes, the most satisfying revenge is not screaming until your lungs give out. It is simply letting them realize who you actually are when it is far too late to apologize. My name is Helen Whitlock, and from the 42nd floor of the Aurora Zenith building, Chicago looked less like a city and more like a circuit board of gold and steel humming with energy. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling glass, sipping an espresso that cost more than my biological mother used to spend on my entire school wardrobe, watching the ant-sized cars crawl along the magnificent mile. The office behind me was a testament to a life built from scratch. Sleek, mid-century modern furniture, a desk made of reclaimed walnut, and awards for art direction that I had never bothered to show the people who shared my DNA. To the design world, I was a force of nature, the invisible hand guiding the aesthetic of a global media empire. To the woman whose number was currently flashing on my phone screen, I was simply the mistake she had never quite managed to correct. I stared at the name on the screen. Mother, a word that should conjure warmth, the smell of baking bread, or soft embraces. For me, it summoned the sensation of walking on eggshells in a house where the air was always too thin to breathe. I debated letting it go to voicemail. I was in the middle of reviewing a high-stakes acquisition portfolio, a deal worth $200 million that would redefine our digital strategy. But old habits, unlike childhood scars, do not fade easily. I swiped right and pressed the phone to my ear. My voice practiced, neutral, and devoid of the exhaustion I felt in my marrow. Hello. Mother, I said, turning my back on the skyline. There was no greeting on the other end, no inquiry about my health, my day, or whether I was even alive. Patricia Sterling operated on a frequency of pure, unadulterated selfishness. Helen, you need to clear your schedule for the second weekend of next month, she announced, her voice possessing that familiar, grating pitch that sounded like silverware scraping against fine china. Isabella is finally getting married, and this time, it is the real deal. I leaned against my heavy walnut desk, closing my eyes for a brief second. Isabella, my younger sister, the golden child, the sun around which our family's dysfunctional solar system revolved. She was 27, 2 years younger than me, and had already been engaged 3 times. Who is it this time? I asked, keeping my tone mild. Mason. Mason Rutherford, she said, the name rolling off her tongue as if she were tasting expensive caviar. He is a businessman. Helen, a legitimate entrepreneur with a portfolio that would make your head spin. Not like those artists you used to hang around with. He is a visionary. I picked up a silver fountain pen, twirling it between my fingers. A visionary. That was usually code for a man with a lot of debt and a good tailor. That is wonderful. Mother, I am happy for her. I lied, the words tasting like ash. Yes. Well, that is why I am calling, she continued, not pausing for breath. The wedding is going to be at the Sapphire Cliffs Resort in Newport. It is going to be an event. Helen, the press might even be there. Mason has connections. I knew the Sapphire Cliffs. I knew it intimately because Aurora Zenith had acquired the parent company of that resort chain 6 months ago. I had personally approved the rebranding of their lobby design. The irony was a bitter pill, but I swallowed it without a sound. I will check my calendar, I said. Listen to me closely. Helen. Her voice dropped an octave, shifting from boastful to conspiratorial, a tone that always preceded a blow to my self-esteem. We need to talk about the guest list. Mason's family is established, old money. They are people of consequence. I waited. I knew what was coming. It was a script we had rehearsed 1,000 times in different iterations throughout my life. I do not want you bringing anyone, she said, the command landing with a dull thud. I blinked, looking at the empty chair across from my desk. I am seeing someone. Actually, I started to say, though I wasn't, it was a reflexive defense mechanism. A phantom shield. No. She cut me off. Sharp and absolute. Do not lie to me. And even if you are, I do not want some scruffy freelancer or starving artist sitting at my table. You come alone. Is that understood? I have told Mason's mother that you are focusing on your little freelance projects. It sounds better than saying you are unmarried and drifting at 29. Drifting. I looked around my office, a space that cost more to rent per month than my parents' house was worth. I looked at the contract on my desk, authorizing a marketing budget of $5 million. But to Patricia, if you did not have a ring on your finger and a husband to pay your bills, you were merely existing, not living. And Helen, she added, the final nail in the coffin. I have seated you at table 19. It is near the back, by the sound booth. I do not want any awkward questions about why you are alone while Isabella is up there in a Vera Wang gown. It is for your own good. You know how uncomfortable you get when people stare. I remembered being 10 years old, wearing a dress that was too tight because she refused to buy me a new one, claiming Isabella needed braces more than I needed to breathe. I remembered standing in the corner at family gatherings while Isabella performed ballet routines, receiving applause while I held her coat. The bias wasn't just a habit, it was the foundation of our family architecture. Fine, Mother, I said, my voice barely a whisper. Alone. Table 19. Good. Do not be late, and try to wear something appropriate. Nothing flashy. Let your sister have her day. The line went dead. I lowered the phone, staring at the screen until it went black. A laugh bubbled up in my throat, but it was devoid of humor. It was a dry, rattling sound. Table 19, near the sound equipment, hidden away like a dirty secret so the wealthy in-laws wouldn't realize the bride had a sister who was a failure. I stood up and walked over to the sidebar, pouring myself a glass of sparkling water. My hand was shaking slightly, not from sadness. I had mourned the loss of my mother's love years ago, but from a rage that felt cold and heavy, like a stone in my gut. They thought I was destitute. They thought I scraped by on graphic design gigs, living in a studio apartment, eating instant noodles. I had let them believe it. It was my armor. If they knew I was the senior art director of Aurora Zenith, if they knew my net worth, they would not love me. They would consume me. They would drain me dry until I was nothing but a husk. A knock at the door broke my reverie. Come in, I called out, composing my face into the mask of cool efficiency that had earned me the nickname the Ice Queen among the junior interns. The heavy oak door swung open, and two people walked in who made the very air in the room feel warmer, Richard and Eleanor Sterling. They were not my blood, but they were my parents in every way that mattered. Richard, with his silver hair and impeccably tailored suit, was the CEO of Aurora Zenith. Eleanor, elegant in a cashmere shawl, was the philanthropist heart of the company. They had found me 10 years ago. Shivering in a library, working 3 jobs to pay for the tuition my biological parents had refused to cover because Isabella needed a gap year in Italy to find herself. The Sterlings had taken me in, mentored me, and eventually, when my talent became undeniable, hired me. Helen, dear, Eleanor said, her eyes immediately zeroing in on the tension in my shoulders. She walked over and placed a hand on my arm. That was the donor calling, wasn't it? We jokingly referred to Patricia as the donor, the woman who donated genetic material and nothing else. She invited me to Isabella's wedding. I said, walking back to my desk and sitting down, I am to go alone, and sit in the back, apparently. I am an embarrassment to the family image. Richard snorted, a rare sound of derision from a man known for his diplomatic composure. He walked over to the panoramic window, looking out at the city he helped build. An embarrassment. The woman who just redesigned our entire European visual identity is an embarrassment. Their ignorance would be comical if it were not so cruel. It is fine, I said, picking up a file. I probably won't go. I have the merger to focus on. Richard turned around, his expression shifting. A glint appeared in his gray eyes, a look I had seen before hostile takeovers. Actually, Helen, that is exactly what I wanted to talk to you about. The merger, or rather, the smaller acquisitions we are considering to bolster our tech portfolio. He tossed a thick folder onto my desk. It landed with a heavy slap atop my sleek notebook. I picked it up. The label on the tab read, TechStream Solutions, Investment Applications/Series B Funding. I frowned. The name sounded familiar, but in the sea of startups I reviewed daily, they all blurred together. Why am I looking at this? Richard? This is usually financials' headache, not creatives, because the CEO of this company has been calling my office 3 times a day for the past week, Richard said, sitting on the edge of my desk. A breach of protocol he only allowed himself with me. He is desperate. His cash flow is negative. He is bleeding money, but he has a decent proprietary algorithm. He needs a lifeline. He needs us to buy 40% of his company, or he goes under within 6 months. I opened the file. The first page contained the executive summary and the bio of the founder. My eyes scanned the text, and then they stopped. The world seemed to tilt on its axis for a fraction of a second. CEO and founder. Mason Rutherford. I looked up at Richard. He was watching me closely, a knowing look on his face. Mason Rutherford. I repeated, the name tasting different now. It didn't taste like caviar. It tasted like blood in the water. Is that him? Eleanor asked softly, stepping up beside Richard. The fiancé? I nodded slowly. Yes, that is him, the visionary businessman. Richard crossed his arms. He does not know who you are. Helen, to him, the art director of Aurora Zenith is just a name on an org chart. If he even looked that deep, he certainly does not know that Helen Whitlock, the freelance designer's sister-in-law he is about to shun, is the same woman who holds the veto power on this investment. I looked back down at the file. I saw the numbers. Red, bleeding, desperate. Mason Rutherford wasn't rich. He was leveraging a future he didn't have to marry a girl who wanted a life he couldn't afford. He was coming to Aurora Zenith begging for money. And my biological mother was treating me like a peasant while her future son-in-law was essentially holding a tin cup outside my office building. The irony was so sharp it could cut glass. He needs this deal, Richard said, his voice low. Without our capital, his empire collapses, and I have not signed off on it yet. I told the board I wanted a final review from the creative department regarding their branding potential. That means I started, my mind racing. That means you decide. Richard said simply, you can sign off on it. Give him the money, and let him play the big shot. Or you can reject it. It is entirely your call, professional or personal. I trust your judgment, but he does not know you are the gatekeeper. I sat back in my leather chair, the leather creaking softly. A plan began to form in the dark recesses of my mind, a place I usually kept locked away. They wanted me to be the audience. They wanted me to be the silent, shameful spectator to their glory. But they didn't know who was directing the play. I looked at the wedding invitation that I had pulled up on my digital calendar. Sapphire Cliffs Resort, the union of Isabella and Mason. If I don't go, I said, half to myself, I am just the bitter sister who stayed home. I confirmed their narrative. And if you do go? Eleanor asked, her eyes twinkling with a hint of mischief. If I go, I tapped my fingernail against Mason's photo in the file. I go as myself. Not the version they created, but the version I built. I looked up at Richard and Eleanor. I want to go, and I want to accept the invitation exactly as it was given. I will go alone. I will sit at the back. I will let them sneer and whisper. And the deal? Richard asked, gesturing to the file. Keep it in limbo, I said, a cold smile touching my lips, a smile that felt foreign, sharp, and dangerous. Tell Mr. Rutherford that the board is sending a high-level executive to his wedding to evaluate his character and family values before making a final decision. Don't tell him who. Let him sweat. Let him think he has to impress every stranger in the room. Richard laughed, a deep, booming sound. That is wicked. I love it. I picked up the heavy cardstock invitation that Patricia had mailed, a courtesy she likely billed to Mason's credit card. I ran my thumb over the embossed lettering. It felt expensive. It felt like a lie. I am going to that wedding, I whispered, and I'm going to watch them build their castle on a foundation of sand, and when the tide comes in, I will be the one controlling the waves. I closed the file on Mason Rutherford's life with a definitive snap. I will be there, Mother, I thought, and I will be the best guest you never wanted. The silence in my office was heavy, but it was nothing compared to the silence that had filled my childhood home. Standing there, looking at the city lights of Chicago, my mind did not drift to the spreadsheet on my desk or the impending merger with Mason's failing company. Instead, it snapped back like a rubber band to a kitchen table 10 years ago. It was the day I realized that in the ledger of my parents' affections, I was a line item they were desperate to erase. I had been 19 years old. I remembered the texture of the envelope in my hand. It was thick, cream-colored, and stamped with the crest of the Rhode Island School of Design. It was my golden ticket. I had not just been accepted. I had been recognized as a talent worth nurturing. But the scholarship only covered 60% of the tuition. I needed help with the rest. I sat at the kitchen table, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. My mother, Patricia, was flipping through a travel magazine, and my father was cleaning his golf clubs. Isabella, 17 at the time, and already perfecting the art of weaponized incompetence, was lounging on the sofa, painting her nails a shade of pink that I would later associate with deception. I got in. I had said, my voice trembling with a pride I foolishly thought they would share. Patricia did not look up. That is nice. Helen, did you remember to pick up Isabella's dry cleaning? I pushed the acceptance letter across the table. No. Mom, look, I got into the design program. It is one of the best in the country. I need to send the deposit by Friday. She finally looked up, her eyes scanning the paper with the same disinterest one might show a utility bill. Then came the sigh, a long, suffering exhale that signaled I was being difficult simply by existing. We do not have the money. Helen, she said flatly. I frowned. But Dad just bought a new boat, and you guys are redoing the patio. That is different, she snapped. Those are investments in our lifestyle. Your art school is a hobby. Besides, we have already allocated the education fund. I felt a flicker of hope. So there is a fund? Yes, she said, turning the page of her magazine. For Isabella. The room seemed to tilt. For Isabella? She is a junior in high school. She barely passes her classes. Isabella is going to Europe next summer, Patricia said, as if explaining gravity to a toddler. She needs to do a grand tour. Italy, France, Spain. That is where she will meet the right kind of people, the kind of people who marry well. That is an investment. Helen, you drawing pictures in a studio for 4 years? That is a waste. I looked at my father, begging for support. He rubbed a spot on his 9-iron and didn't meet my eyes. Your mother knows best. Helen, you can always go to community college, or just get a job. That was the moment the umbilical cord didn't just cut. It withered and died. I realized then that I wasn't their daughter. I was the background noise they tolerated while waiting for the main act to start. I did not argue. I did not scream. I simply stood up, took my letter, and walked out. That night, I moved out of the house and into a studio apartment the size of a closet that smelled permanently of boiled cabbage. For the next 2 years, I did not sleep. I worked 3 jobs. I waited tables at a diner where the truckers tipped in quarters. I freelance designed logos for $5 an hour, and I worked the night shift at the university library, shelving books while my peers were out partying. I was exhausted. My hands were dry and cracked from cheap soap, and my soul felt like it was being sanded down to dust. But destiny has a funny way of hiding in the quiet corners. It was a Tuesday evening in late November. The library was nearly empty. I was pushing a cart of encyclopedias near the reference section when I heard a crash. A woman in a camel hair coat had dropped a stack of files. Papers were everywhere, sliding across the polished floor. Most people would have kept walking. I stopped. I knelt down and began gathering the papers. organizing them instinctively by date and category as I picked them up. "You have an eye for order," a voice said. I looked up. The woman was older, perhaps in her late 50s, with silver hair cut in a sharp bob and eyes that were intelligent and kind. It was Eleanor Sterling. I did not know who she was then. I just knew she had a presence that made the air feel still. "I'm just putting them back the way they fell," I said, handing her the stack. "No, you are not," she corrected me, a small smile playing on her lips. "You just reorganized my entire quarterly projection in 30 seconds. That is not an accident. That is a skill." She asked my name. Then she asked what I was studying, when I told her about the design program and my 3 jobs. She didn't offer me pity. She offered me a card. "I need an assistant who understands visual organization," she said. "The pay is better than shelving books. Be at my office at 8 o'clock tomorrow morning." That was the beginning. The Sterlings did not just employ me. They adopted me in spirit long before they ever said the words aloud. Eleanor taught me that true wealth was not about flashing logos or loud vacations. It was about how you treated the waiter, how you held your spine when you walked into a room, and the quiet confidence of knowing your own value. Richard taught me business, how to read a contract, how to spot a liar by the way they shifted in their chair, and how to negotiate without ever raising my voice. They filled the hollow spaces my parents had carved out of me, but the scars were still there. And the final break with my biological family didn't happen until a rainy afternoon 3 years later. I was 22. I had been riding my bicycle to the office when a delivery truck ran a red light. I swerved, hit the curb, and went flying. I woke up in the emergency room with a fractured wrist and a concussion. The nurse asked for my emergency contact. Instinctively, foolishly, I gave her my mother's number. I lay in that hospital bed, staring at the fluorescent lights, my head throbbing, waiting for my mother to rush in. I waited for an hour, then 2. Finally, I borrowed the nurse's phone and called her again. "Helen?" Patricia's voice was impatient, accompanied by the rustle of fabric in the background. "Why are you calling again? I told you we are busy." "Mom," I whispered, my voice thick with pain. "I am in the hospital. I got hit by a car. I think my wrist is broken. I have no one here." There was a pause, then a sigh of irritation. "Oh, for heaven's sake, Helen, you are always so dramatic. Are you dying?" "No. But then it can wait." She cut me off. "Isabella is trying on her engagement dress for the rehearsal dinner. The lighting in this boutique is terrible, and she needs my opinion. We cannot just leave. Take a taxi home. We will stop by eventually. Maybe tomorrow." The line went dead. I held the phone, listening to the dial tone, and something inside me finally shattered. It wasn't my wrist. It was the last fragile hope that mattered to them. They were looking at silk and lace while I was bleeding on a gurney. I did not cry. I couldn't. I dialed the only other number I knew by heart. Eleanor picked up on the first ring. "I am coming," she said simply, before I could even finish explaining. 20 minutes later, Richard and Eleanor burst into the ER. Richard looked ready to buy the hospital just to fire whoever had made me wait, and Eleanor held my uninjured hand so tightly I thought she might never let go. They paid the bills. They drove me to their home. They sat with me through the night to make sure I didn't have a seizure from the concussion. 2 days later, Patricia finally called. She didn't ask how I was. She called to complain that my drama had upset Isabella and ruined their shopping trip. "Isabella was so stressed about you that she broke out in hives." Patricia had scolded. "You really need to be more considerate of your sister's feelings." Helen. That was the day the Helen they knew died. The girl who craved their approval, who worked 3 jobs to prove her worth, who begged for scraps of love. She vanished. In her place rose someone colder, sharper, and infinitely stronger. I stopped visiting. I stopped sharing details of my life. I let them believe I was struggling because it was easier than explaining my success to people who would only resent it or try to exploit it. I brought myself back to the present, the memory fading like smoke in a strong wind. I stood in the center of my walk-in closet in my penthouse apartment. The space was filled with rows of tailored suits and designer wear. But tonight, I needed something specific. I needed a weapon disguised as a dress. Patricia had demanded I wear something appropriate and not flashy. She wanted me to look like the poor relation, the drab spinster sister fading into the background. I reached for a garment bag at the far end of the rack. I unzipped it, and the fabric spilled out like liquid midnight. It was a custom creation by a designer in Milan who only accepted commissions from a private client list. The dress was a deep, dark navy, so dark it was almost black, but under the lights, it shimmered with a subtle, sapphire undertone. It was made of heavy silk crepe that draped over the body like water. The design was deceptively simple: a high neck, long sleeves, and a back that plunged dangerously low, revealing an expanse of skin. There were no sequins, no crystals, no loud logos. The luxury was in the cut, the way it moved, the way it commanded attention by refusing to ask for it. It was the kind of dress that made cheap rhinestone-covered ball gowns look like costumes. It whispered money rather than screaming it. I slipped it on. The silk was cool against my skin. I looked in the full-length mirror. The woman staring back was not the 19-year-old girl crying at the kitchen table. She was not the 22-year-old with a broken wrist waiting for a mother who never came. She was Helen Whitlock. She was a woman who managed multi-million-dollar budgets. She was a woman who had built a family out of strangers because her own blood had turned poisonous. I fastened a simple pair of diamond studs to my ears, a gift from Richard for my 25th birthday. I applied a coat of deep red lipstick, sharp enough to cut. I was not going to Newport to cause a scene. I wasn't going to throw wine on the bride or scream at my mother during the toast. That was the behavior of the powerless. That was what the old Helen might have fantasized about. No, I was going to do something much more devastating. I was going to be a witness. I was going to sit at table 19. I was going to smile politely. I was going to watch Isabella preen in her white dress, thinking she had won a prize, unaware that the prize was a man drowning in debt. I was going to watch my mother gloat, unaware that the daughter she scorned held the keys to her family's social survival. I checked my clutch to make sure my phone was there. The phone that contained the email drafted to the board of directors regarding the TechStream acquisition. The email was saved in my drafts folder. It was not sent yet. I took a deep breath. The air in the penthouse was filtered and clean, unlike the stifling air of my childhood home. It is time, I said to the empty room. I walked out the door, my heels clicking on the marble floor with a rhythm that sounded like a clock ticking down. I was ready to play my part. I would be the ghost at the feast, the shadow in the corner. And when the spotlight finally hit me, I would not be the one blinking in surprise. The drive to the airport would take 40 minutes. The flight to Newport was another hour. I had time to steel myself. I had time to remember every slight, every insult, every moment of neglect, and pack them down into a tight, cold ball in the center of my chest. They would be my fuel. My mother wanted me to be invisible? Fine. I would be the darkness that swallowed them whole. The salt air of Newport, Rhode Island, usually smells of old money and maritime history. But as I drove my sleek, charcoal gray sedan through the wrought iron gates of the Sapphire Cliffs Resort, the air tasted distinctly of desperation disguised as opulence. I knew this property better than the groundskeepers did. 2 years ago, when Aurora Zenith acquired the hospitality group that owned this resort, I had personally overseen the architectural renovation. I knew that the marble in the lobby was imported from Tuscany, and I knew that the profit margins for the ballroom events were calculated to the penny. It was ironic that my sister was getting married in a venue that I technically helped manage. Yet I was arriving like a thief in the night. My phone had buzzed 3 hours earlier while I was still on the highway. It was Isabella. "Helen, where are you?" Her voice had been breathless, pitched high with a frantic energy that she probably thought sounded charming. The florist is an absolute idiot. The centerpieces are tilting to the left, and the bridal suite is a mess. I need you here early. You are so good with your hands, and you know how to fix things. Please tell me you are not going to be late. She did not ask me to come early to share a glass of champagne or to have a sisterly moment before she walked down the aisle. She wanted unpaid labor. She wanted the fixer, the background character who would straighten the tablecloths while she practiced her smile for the photographers. "I am on my way, Isabella," I had replied, my voice steady. "I will be there by 2 o'clock. "Good," she had snapped, dropping the sweetness instantly, "and park in the lower lot, the one near the service entrance. Mason has the valet reserved for the VIP guests, and we are expecting some very important people. We cannot have the lot clogged up with, well, regular cars." I did not tell her that my car, a custom-engine German import, cost more than Mason's entire wedding budget. I simply said, "Understood," and hung up. Now. I steered my car past the valet stand where young men in white jackets were waiting to park the leased Bentleys of Mason's creditors. I drove down the winding service road, exactly as instructed, and parked next to a delivery van unloading crates of lobster. I checked my reflection in the rearview mirror. The woman staring back was calm, composed, and terrifyingly patient. I stepped out, smoothing the silk of my dark navy dress, and walked toward the side entrance. The resort was buzzing with the chaotic energy that precedes a high society wedding. Waiters were sprinting with trays of crystal stemware, and the sound of a string quartet warming up drifted from the main terrace. I walked through the service corridors, the heels of my shoes clicking against the concrete floor. I knew the layout by heart. I emerged into the main lobby near the grand staircase, intending to slip into the shadows, but fate had other plans. A man in a sharp tuxedo was berating a concierge at the front desk. He turned sharply, his face flushed with stress, and our eyes locked. It was Antoine, the general manager of Sapphire Cliffs. His eyes went wide. The color drained from his face as he recognized me. He dropped the clipboard he was holding. It clattered loudly against the marble floor. "Ms. Whitlock stammered, stepping forward, his hands trembling slightly. My goodness, we were not informed of a site visit. I would have prepared the presidential suite. "Is there something wrong with the quarterly review? I can explain the numbers for the—" I raised a single finger to my lips, cutting him off. His mouth snapped shut. "Antoine," I said softly, stepping closer so only he could hear. "I am not here on business, not officially." He looked confused, glancing from my evening gown to the bustling lobby. "Then why?" "My sister is the bride," I said, "Isabella Whitlock." Antoine looked as if I had just told him the sky was made of neon green jello. "Your sister?" "But Mr. Rutherford, the groom, has been screaming at my staff all morning about discounts and payment extensions. He never mentioned—" "He does not know," I said, my voice dropping to a whisper, "and neither do you. As far as you are concerned, I am just a guest. A very quiet, unimportant guest. Do you understand?" Antoine was a smart man. He saw the glint in my eye, the steel behind the smile. He nodded vigorously. "Of course, Ms. Whitlock, complete discretion. If you need anything at all, my staff is at your disposal. I need you to treat me like a stranger." I said, "That is an order." I left him standing there, looking like he needed a stiff drink, and made my way toward the bridal suite. The door was ajar. I could hear the sound of laughter, shrill, excited, and cruel. I stopped just outside the door, leaning against the wall. Honestly, Mom, I was terrified she would show up in something from a thrift store. Isabella's voice floated out. "You know how she is. She thinks being artsy is an excuse to look like a hobo." I heard my mother, Patricia, sigh. "We just have to manage her. Bella." I told her to sit at table 19. It is behind the pillar near the kitchen doors, hopefully. She will just eat her dinner and leave before the dancing starts. It is tragic, really. 29 years old and still drifting, no husband, no real career, just those little drawing jobs she does. "She is probably jealous," Isabella said, her voice dripping with satisfaction. "Look at this wedding. Look at Mason. He is going to be a CEO soon, and she is well. She is Helen." I stood there, listening to them dissect my character with the precision of butchers. It should have hurt. 10 years ago, I would have been crying in the bathroom. But now, I felt nothing but a cold, clinical detachment. They were writing a tragedy for themselves. And they did not even know they were holding the pen. I walked in. The room went silent. Isabella was standing on a podium, surrounded by 3 bridesmaids who were fluffing the train of her dress. Patricia was sitting on a velvet chaise lounge, holding a glass of champagne. "You are here," Patricia said, not getting up. "You are late. I am exactly on time," I said, my voice flat. Isabella looked me up and down. Her eyes narrowed as she took in my dress. It was simple, yes, but the way the silk caught the light made her stiff. Beaded bodice looked cheap in comparison. "Well, at least you are covered up." She sniffed. "The flowers in the ballroom are a mess. One of the vases is cracked. Go check it, and make sure the place cards on table 19 are straight." I looked at her, really looked at her. Beneath the layers of makeup and the expensive lace, I saw fear. She was brittle. She was marrying a man she barely knew for a lifestyle she could not earn, and she was projecting all her insecurity onto me. "I will take care of it," I said. I turned and walked out. I did not fix the flowers. I did not straighten the place cards. Instead, I walked to the terrace overlooking the ocean. The Atlantic was a deep, churning gray. I needed fresh air. My phone vibrated in my clutch. It was Richard Sterling. "Hello, Richard," I answered, watching a seagull fight the wind. "Helen, we are 10 minutes away." Richard's voice was booming and cheerful. "Eleanor is fussing with her earrings, but we are on schedule." "You are coming?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "We would not miss it," he said. "You should have heard the voicemail Mason left my secretary. He was practically begging. He called us titans of industry and said our presence would bless his union. He thinks we are coming to sign the deal. Helen, he thinks this wedding is his closing pitch." I gripped the railing of the balcony. "He has no idea." "None," Richard confirmed. "We are coming as the potential investors, but when we walk through those doors, we are coming for you. We are going to greet the host, and then we are going to find our daughter." A lump formed in my throat, unexpected and sharp. "Thank you, Richard. It is going to be quite a show." He chuckled. "See you soon, kid." I hung up and turned back toward the ballroom. As I passed the open doors of the groom's holding room, I heard a voice that made my blood run cold. It was Mason. He sounded frantic. "I do not care what it costs. Put it on the corporate card." He was shouting into a phone. "Just keep the investors happy if the Sterlings walk out of here without a positive impression. We are dead. Do you hear me? Dead." He slammed the phone down. I stepped into the doorway, just enough to be seen. Mason looked up. He was a handsome man in a superficial way, square jaw, blonde hair, but his eyes were shifty, darting around the room like a trapped animal. He did not recognize me. He saw a woman in a dark dress and assumed I was staff or a distant relative. "Can I help you?" he snapped, adjusting his cufflinks. "I am Helen," I said simply, "Isabella's sister." His face went blank for a second. Then recognition dawned. "Oh, the freelancer. Right. Patricia mentioned you were coming." He looked me over, dismissing me in a single glance. "Look, I am very busy right now. I have VIPs arriving any minute. Richard Sterling. You know who that is?" "No, of course you don't." "He owns half the media in this country." I remained silent, my face a perfect mask of polite disinterest. "Just try not to get in the way." "Okay," Mason said, waving his hand dismissively. "Go find your seat, and if you see the Sterlings, an older couple, look like they own the place, stay away from them. I do not need you to bore them with talk about whatever it is you do, arts and crafts." I smiled. It was a small, razor-thin smile. "I promise, Mason, I will not say a word to them about my arts and crafts." "Good," he said, turning his back to me to check his reflection in the mirror. He leaned in, whispering to his own reflection, but loud enough for me to hear. "This is it. Mason, the Sterlings are the key. Nail this, and you are set for life." He turned back to me, his eyes gleaming with a manic sort of greed. Isabella needs to be perfect. Tell her that. Tell her the people who hold my fate, my actual destiny, are walking through those doors. She better treat them like royalty. I nodded slowly. I will tell her. I walked away, the sound of his arrogant laughter echoing in the hallway. He was right. The people who held his fate were walking through the doors. He just didn't realize that one of them had been standing in front of him the whole time, and he had just dismissed her as a nuisance. I made my way into the ballroom. It was a cavernous space filled with white roses and crystal chandeliers. I found table 19. It was exactly where my mother had said it would be, tucked behind a large structural pillar. Next to the swinging doors of the kitchen, the table was set for 8, but only 6 chairs were occupied. My seatmates were an elderly couple who looked confused to be there. A teenage cousin with headphones around his neck, and 2 men wearing black polo shirts who were clearly the audio technicians taking a break. I sat down. The chair was wobbly. I poured myself a glass of the house red wine, not the premium vintage Mason had reserved for the head table, and took a sip. It was tart and cheap. From my vantage point, I could see the head table perfectly. It was elevated on a dais, draped in gold cloth. Isabella and Mason would sit there like a king and queen surveying their kingdom. The guests began to filter in. I saw aunts and uncles I had not spoken to in years. They glanced at me, whispered behind their hands, and looked away. I saw the pity in their eyes. Poor Helen, alone, sitting with the sound crew. Let them look, I thought, taking another sip of wine. Let them pity the ghost. The lights dimmed, the orchestra swelled, the doors swung open, and the announcer's voice boomed. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the newlyweds, Mr. and Mrs. Mason Rutherford. Isabella walked in, beaming, clutching Mason's arm. She looked beautiful, I had to admit, but there was a hardness in her eyes as she scanned the room, counting the heads, calculating the value of the gifts. Mason looked sweaty. He was smiling, but his eyes were constantly darting to the main entrance, waiting for the Sterlings. He leaned over to Isabella as they walked past the VIP section. I saw his lips move. He was undoubtedly telling her to keep an eye out for the important guests. They took their seats on the dais. My mother, seated next to them, looked like the cat who had swallowed the canary. She scanned the room until her eyes landed on table 19. She saw me sitting in the shadows. She offered a small, triumphant nod, as if to say, "Stay there. That is where you belong." I raised my glass to her in a silent toast. "Enjoy the view, Mother," I thought, because the curtain is about to drop, and you are on the wrong side of the stage. The waiters began to serve the salad. The air was thick with chatter and the clinking of silverware. Everyone was playing their part in the charade of the happy family. I sat in my corner, the invisible sister, the failure, the spectator. But in my mind, I was already counting down the seconds. The Sterlings were late, fashionably, powerfully late, and when they arrived, the foundation of this wedding was going to crack wide open. I swirled the cheap wine in my glass, watching the red liquid coat the sides, looking disturbingly like blood. I was ready to understand the absolute silence that would soon descend upon this ballroom. One first had to understand the noise that preceded it. The transition from the cocktail terrace to the main reception hall was a choreographed migration of 300 guests, a sea of silk, satin, and rented tuxedos flowing through the double mahogany doors. I waited until the majority of the crowd had filtered in, preferring to slip into the stream rather than lead it. I adjusted the strap of my clutch. My dress, the custom midnight blue silk from Milan, felt like a second skin. To the untrained eye, which, unfortunately, included every single member of my biological family. It was merely a plain, dark gown. They did not see the hand-rolled hem. They did not recognize the architectural precision of the bias cut that allowed the fabric to move like liquid smoke. They saw a lack of sequins and assumed a lack of value. I stepped into the threshold of the ballroom. The air was refrigerated to a crisp 68 degrees and smelled of expensive lilies and impending judgment. "Helen!" The hiss came from my left. My mother, Patricia, materialized from behind a large floral arrangement like a gatekeeper to purgatory. She was wearing a gold sequined gown that was aggressively bright, tight enough to restrict circulation, and loud enough to be heard from space. Her face was a mask of panic and irritation. "I told you to use the service entrance," she whispered furiously, gripping my upper arm. Her nails dug into my skin. A familiar pinch from my childhood, meant to correct posture or silence giggles. "Hello." "Mother," I said, gently but firmly removing her hand from my arm. I smoothed the fabric where she had touched me. "The service entrance is for staff. I am a guest. Or did I misread the invitation you sent?" "Don't get smart with me," she snapped, her eyes darting around to see if anyone of importance had witnessed our interaction. "I just wanted you to slip in quietly. Look at you. You look like you are going to a funeral. Couldn't you have found something pink? Or at least something with a little sparkle? You are going to bring down the mood. I am wearing navy." "Mother, it is a classic color," I replied, my voice devoid of emotion. "And I am sitting in the back, as you requested." "How can I bring down the mood from the shadows?" Patricia huffed, adjusting her heavy diamond necklace, a piece I knew was a high-quality cubic zirconia because my father had stopped buying real gems in the 90s. "Just go. Go to your table. And for heaven's sake, try to look like you are happy for your sister. No sour faces. We have a photographer from the Newport Life magazine here. If you see a lens, turn away. I do not want your expression ruining the spread." I watched her bustling away to greet a local councilman, her smile switching on like a light bulb. It was a masterclass in superficiality. I began the long walk to table 19. The room was arranged in concentric circles radiating out from the head table. The closer you were to the bride and groom, the more you mattered. The first ring was the wealthy in-laws and business partners. The second ring was close friends and family. As I moved further out, the status dropped. I walked past aunts who had not called me in a decade. "There she is." I heard Aunt Marge whisper to her daughter, "Look at that dress. So severe. She looks thin." The daughter whispered back, loud enough for me to hear, "Do you think she is sick? Or just poor? I heard she is still doing that freelance thing in the city. Probably cannot afford a decent meal." Marge concluded with a sympathetic cluck of her tongue. "It is a shame. She had so much potential before she became so difficult." I kept my chin high, my eyes fixed on the far wall. Their pity was a currency I had no use for. They created a narrative to make themselves feel better about their neglect. If Helen was a failure, then their decision to ignore me was justified. If I was successful, they were monsters. Therefore, I had to be a failure. I reached table 19. It was arguably the worst seat in the house. It was tucked into a corner, partially obscured by a massive structural pillar wrapped in tulle. To my right was the swinging door to the kitchen, which meant every 30 seconds, I would be hit with a waft of steam and the sound of clattering dishes. To my left was the lighting control board. I took my seat. The chair wobbled. "Hello?" I said to the table at large. Next to me, a man in a black polo shirt with a headset around his neck nodded. He was the audio technician. "Hey, your family?" "Something like that," I said. Across from me sat Cousin Joey, a 19-year-old college dropout who was currently picking at a bread roll. He looked at me, then back at his phone. "Hey, Helen, long time." "Hi, Joey." That was the extent of the welcome. I was the exile returning to the colony, and I had been assigned to the leper table. Suddenly, a hush fell over the room, followed by a ripple of applause. The bridal party was making their rounds before the dinner service began. Isabella was floating through the tables, her white ball gown taking up the space of 3 people. She was laughing, touching arms, accepting compliments with a practiced humility that made my teeth ache. She spotted me. Her eyes lit up, not with warmth, but with the predatory gleam of a cat spotting a mouse that had already been maimed. She steered her massive skirt toward table 19, leaving Mason behind to charm a group of bankers. "Helen!" she exclaimed, her voice pitched perfectly to carry to the surrounding tables. She leaned down to hug me. The embrace was stiff, and she smelled of expensive perfume and hairspray. "You actually came," she whispered in my ear, her voice dropping to a venomous hiss. "I thought you might be too embarrassed to show up alone." Again, I pulled back, looking her in the eye. "I wouldn't miss it. Isabella, it is a very impressive production." She straightened up. "Preening, isn't it?" Mason spared no expense. Well, almost no expense. She glanced at the sound technician next to me and then back at my dress. "I see you went with minimal effort." "That is so brave of you. I mean, to just not care what people think. I could never do that. You look lovely." "Isabella," I said, refusing to take the bait. "The dress suits you perfectly." It was a backhanded compliment. The dress was loud, excessive, and structurally unstable, much like her relationship, but she took it at face value. "Thanks," she smirked. "And thank you for sitting back here, honestly. Having you in the background really helps. It makes the head table pop so much more when the foreground isn't cluttered. You are a great prop." "Helen?" She patted my shoulder. A gesture one might use on a slow child or a well-behaved dog. "Enjoy the chicken," she said. "I made sure they put the sauce on the side for you. I know how picky you are." She swirled away, gathering her train, heading back toward the light. I watched her go. She really believed she was the sun. She had no idea that a total eclipse was coming. Then came Mason. He was following in her wake, shaking hands, patting backs. He looked frantic beneath the veneer of the happy groom. His eyes were scanning the room, undoubtedly looking for the Sterlings. He passed right by table 19. He looked directly at me. I held his gaze. I waited for a nod. A hello. A basic acknowledgement of existence. He looked through me as if I were made of glass. To him, I was just a dark shape in the corner, an obstacle to navigate around. He did not even break stride. He turned to the audio technician next to me. "Hey, buddy," he barked. The mic on the podium was buzzing earlier. "Fix it before the speeches. All right? I am not paying you for static. On it, boss." The tech grumbled. Mason moved on, chasing the smell of money, completely unaware that he had just snubbed the one person who could sign his salvation check. I sat back in my chair. The waiter arrived and poured wine into my glass. It was a cheap Merlot, acidic and thin. I swirled it, watching the red legs run down the crystal. The room was buzzing with energy. People were laughing, toasting, celebrating the union of two families. From my corner, it looked like a play. The actors were hitting their marks. The lighting was flattering. The script was written. But plays can have plot twists. I took a sip of the wine. It tasted like vinegar. But I swallowed it without grimacing. In the center of the room, on the dais, Patricia was waving to someone. She looked triumphant. She had her wealthy son-in-law, her beautiful daughter, and her disappointing daughter safely tucked away in the shadows. Her world was in perfect order. I checked my watch. It was 7:15. Richard and Eleanor were punctual people. They would be walking through those doors in exactly 5 minutes. I looked at the empty chair next to me, the one Patricia had insisted remain empty because I was forbidden from bringing a guest. "You wanted me alone." "Mother," I thought, my fingers tightening around the stem of the glass. "You wanted me isolated. You wanted to make sure I knew my place." I looked at the stage where Isabella was now kissing Mason for the cameras. A flash of white teeth and white lace. "Well, I am here, and I am watching." The audio technician leaned over to me. "Nice family," he muttered, sarcasm dripping from his voice. "You have no idea," I replied, a small, cold smile touching my lips. "Just wait for the second act." The lights in the ballroom dimmed slightly. The MC walked up to the microphone, tapping it to check the sound. "Ladies and gentlemen," he boomed, "if everyone could please take their seats, we are about to begin the toasts." I sat perfectly still. My posture was straight, my expression serene. I was the eye of the storm, the humiliation of the entry, the mother's scolding, the sister's gloating, the groom's dismissal. I took it all. I gathered every single slight and stored it away. They thought they had buried me in the corner. They forgot that seeds grow in the dark. I lifted my glass in a silent toast to the stage. Let the show begin. The master of ceremonies was a man with a tan that came from a bottle and a voice that sounded like it had been dipped in honey and rolled in gravel. He tapped the microphone, a sharp burst of static cutting through the murmur of 300 conversations, and the room obediently fell silent. "Ladies and gentlemen," he boomed, gesturing grandly toward the head table, "we have heard from the best man, who told us some, let us say, colorful stories about the groom's college days. We have heard from the maid of honor, but now, it is time for the heart of this family to speak. Please welcome the mother of the bride, Mrs. Patricia Whitlock." Applause rippled through the ballroom, polite and measured at the edges, but enthusiastic near the front where the people who owed my father money were seated. My mother stood up. She smoothed the front of her gold-sequined gown, took a sip of champagne, and walked to the podium with the air of a queen addressing her subjects. The spotlight hit her, reflecting off the sequins and creating a disco ball effect that was almost blinding. She adjusted the microphone stand, lowering it slightly, and smiled. It was her public smile, the one that reached her mouth but never quite made it to her eyes. "Thank you. Everyone," she began, her voice trembling with a practiced emotion. "Today is a day of such overwhelming joy for me. As a mother, you raise your children with hope. You pray they will make the right choices. You pray they will find partners who equal them in status, in ambition, and in heart." She turned to look at Isabella, who was gazing up at her with adoring eyes. "Isabella, my darling," she continued, her voice gaining strength, "you have always been the light of this family. You never settled for less than you deserved. You knew your worth from the moment you took your first steps. And today, seeing you marry Mason, a man of such vision and success, I know that all my guidance was not in vain. You are a success story, my love." Mason puffed out his chest, looking smug. Isabella wiped a non-existent tear from her eye. I sat in the shadows of table 19, watching the performance. It was impressive, in a grotesque sort of way. She was rewriting history in real time. She was painting Isabella, a girl who had failed out of 2 community colleges and had never held a job for longer than 3 months, as a paragon of determination. She was painting Mason, a man drowning in debt, as a titan of industry. But I knew the script. I knew that for Patricia to elevate Isabella, she had to lower someone else. Balance had to be maintained. Patricia's eyes left the bride. They scanned the room, bypassing the VIPs, bypassing the wealthy cousins, and landing with laser-like precision on the dark corner near the kitchen doors. And she said, her tone shifting, the sweetness remained, but now it was laced with a sickly, condescending pity. "We must not forget the other members of our family." The room went quiet, heads turned, following her gaze. "We are so happy to have Helen here with us today," Patricia said into the microphone. 300 pairs of eyes shifted to table 19. I felt the weight of their attention, heavy and suffocating. I did not move. I did not smile. I simply sat there, my hands folded in my lap. "Helen," Patricia continued, sighing softly into the mic, "we know how hard it is for you. We know that coming to an event like this, so full of love, so full of success, can be challenging for someone in your position." She paused for effect. "I insisted you come, even though you wanted to stay home," she said, lying effortlessly. "Because even though you are sitting there all by yourself, without a partner, without a +1 to hold your hand, I want you to know something." She leaned into the microphone, her voice dropping to a whisper that echoed through the state-of-the-art sound system. "This family will always open its arms to you. We will always be here to offer you the charity of our affection. We will always offer you a seat at the table, even if it is just to witness the happiness you have not yet found for yourself." A ripple of laughter went through the crowd. It started at the head table. Mason chuckled, shaking his head as if to say, "Classic Helen." The bridesmaids giggled behind their bouquets. Then, the guests joined in. It wasn't a warm laugh. It was the nervous, sheepish laughter of a crowd following the lead of a bully. But Patricia's laugh cut through it all. It was loud, sharp, and triumphant. It was a sound I had heard 1,000 times. When I failed a test, when I fell off my bike, when I was rejected from a sorority she hadn't paid for. It was the sound of her establishing dominance. She was laughing at my solitude. She was laughing at the image she had created of me. The sad, lonely spinster sister. The failure who needed their charity to feel included. She wasn't done. "I just hope," Patricia said, wiping a tear of mirth from her eye, "that seeing your sister so happy, seeing what a real, successful marriage looks like, will teach you something. Helen, maybe it will teach you to be less difficult, less picky." Isabella, sitting on the dais, covered her mouth with her hand, her shoulders shaking. She wasn't crying. She was laughing. She looked at me, her eyes dancing with malicious delight. "Look at you," her eyes said. "Look at how small you are." Patricia continued, "Delivering the final blow. You are 29 years old, dear. A woman of your age, sitting alone in the dark well. It is a tragedy, isn't it? But do not worry. We love you anyway, even if you are a bit of a lost cause." The room erupted again. This time, the laughter was louder. It was sanctioned cruelty. They thought they were in on the joke. They thought I was a prop, a caricature of the unlucky sister designed to make the bride shine brighter. I sat there. The wineglass in my hand was cool against my palm. The stem was delicate crystal. I could have snapped it with a twitch of my fingers. 10 years ago, I would have run. I would have burst into tears, fled the room, and spent the night sobbing in my car. 5 years ago, I would have screamed. I would have stood up and shouted about my job, my money, my success. But tonight, something inside me clicked into place. It was the sound of a vault door closing. I did not look down. I did not blush. I did not cry. I slowly lifted my chin. I looked past the audio technician, who was staring at his shoes in secondhand embarrassment. I looked past the cousin who was pretending to check his phone. I looked directly at the stage. I locked eyes with my mother. I did not glare. Glaring implies anger, and anger implies that you care. My expression was something far more terrifying. It was absolute, vacuous zero. It was the look a scientist gives a bacteria sample in a petri dish. It was a look of complete and utter detachment. I stared at her. I didn't blink. Patricia was in the middle of another sentence, something about hoping I would catch the bouquet, when she met my gaze. She paused. The laughter in the room began to die down. Not all at once, but in patches. People sensed the shift. They looked from the stage to table 19, expecting to see a woman cowering or crying. Instead, they saw a woman in a midnight blue dress, sitting with the posture of a queen and the eyes of an executioner. My silence was louder than her microphone. It was a heavy, suffocating silence. It rolled off me like a fog, filling the corners of the room, dampening the mood. It was the silence of someone who knows something the rest of the room does not. Patricia cleared her throat. She shifted her weight from one foot to the other. She tapped the microphone nervously. "Well," she stammered, her smile faltering. "As I said, we are a family." I took a slow sip of my wine. Never breaking eye contact, the movement was deliberate. It was a challenge. "Keep talking. Mother, dig the hole deeper." Isabella stopped laughing. She nudged Mason, pointing at me with her eyes. Mason looked over, frowning. He looked confused. Why wasn't I crying? Why did I look like I was the one in charge? The air in the ballroom grew thick with tension. The guests shifted in their seats. The joke wasn't funny anymore. It felt dangerous. It felt like walking into a cage thinking the tiger was asleep, only to find it wide awake and watching you. Patricia tried to recover. She tried to find that thread of mockery again. "So, let us all raise a glass," she started, her voice losing its booming confidence and becoming shrill. To family." No one raised a glass. They were too busy watching the duel of stares between the dais and the darkness. My mother's face flushed. A bead of sweat trickled down her temple, catching the light. She looked suddenly old. She looked small. I set my glass down on the table with a soft clink. In the silence, it sounded like a gavel striking a block. Patricia opened her mouth to speak again, desperate to fill the void, to reclaim control of the narrative. But she never got the chance. At the far end of the ballroom, the massive double doors, the main entrance, reserved only for the grandest of arrivals, swung open with a resounding boom that shook the floorboards. A gust of wind from the hallway blew in, carrying the scent of rain and ozone. Every head in the room snapped toward the doors. The silence of tension was replaced by the silence of shock. The interruption was sudden, it was violent, and it was exactly on time. If the silence following my mother's speech was the quiet of a tomb, the noise that followed the opening of the doors was the roar of a sudden, violent resurrection. The double doors to the ballroom did not just swing open. They were pushed aside with a synchronized precision that suggested a rehearsal. Framing the entrance were two men who looked less like resort staff and more like the kind of private security that guarded nuclear codes or heads of state. They wore earpieces and suits that strained against professional-grade muscle. They stepped aside, clearing the path, and then, the atmosphere in the room shifted instantly from a tacky wedding reception to a boardroom of global consequence. Richard and Eleanor Sterling walked in. They did not walk. They glided. There is a specific kind of gravity that surrounds people who control billions of dollars. It pulls the air out of the room and forces everyone else to orbit around them. Richard was wearing a tuxedo that made Mason's rented outfit look like a Halloween costume. It was midnight blue, tailored on Savile Row, with lapels that caught the light like shards of obsidian. Eleanor was a vision in silver silk, wearing a vintage diamond choker that likely cost more than the entire gross domestic product of the small island nation Mason claimed to have visited for his bachelor party. Behind them trailed a sleek phalanx of 3 assistants, 2 women and 1 man, all typing furiously on tablets, looking bored and terrifyingly competent. They moved as a single organism, a machine of efficiency cutting through the chaotic humidity of the wedding. The reaction was instantaneous. At the tables near the door, guests froze with their forks halfway to their mouths. A ripple of recognition started at the back and surged forward like a tidal wave. I heard the whispers hiss through the room. Is that Richard Sterling? The media mogul? The owner of Aurora Zenith? What is he doing here? Does Mason know him? On the stage, the transformation in Mason Rutherford was nothing short of miraculous, in the most pathetic sense of the word. One moment, he was the smug lord of the manor, sneering at his wife's poor relations. The next, he was a man possessing the desperate, frantic energy of a drowning sailor spotting a rescue helicopter. His eyes bulged, his jaw actually dropped. He looked at the entrance, then back at Isabella, and then back at the entrance, as if he were hallucinating. "It is them," he mouthed to Isabella, his voice lost in the rising murmur of the crowd. He did not wait for his bride. He did not check on his mother-in-law. Mason Rutherford, the man who had just spent 10 minutes basking in the adoration of his new family, practically vaulted off the dais. He abandoned his wife on the stage, hiked up his pants, and sprinted down the center aisle, nearly tripping over the train of a bridesmaid's dress in his haste. "Mr. Sterling, Mrs. Sterling," he called out, his voice cracking with a sycophantic glee that made my skin crawl. "You made it." I watched from my corner. Swirling my wine, the predator had become the prey, and he did not even know it yet. Mason reached them halfway down the aisle, skidding to a halt. He was breathless, sweating, and beaming with a manic intensity. He extended a hand that was shaking visibly. "Sir, I am honored, truly honored," Mason stammered, pumping Richard's hand as if he were trying to extract water from a stone. "I know how busy you are. The fact that you took time out of your schedule to be here means the world to us. To me." Richard Sterling looked at Mason's hand, then at Mason's face, with a calm, impenetrable expression. He smiled, but it was the smile a shark gives before it decides whether or not to bite. "Mr. Rutherford, Richard said, his voice deep and resonant, carrying effortlessly over the hush of the crowd. We received your voicemail. It was very persuasive. Mason laughed. A nervous, high-pitched sound. I just wanted to make sure you knew how much this partnership means to TechStream. And to see you here well. It feels like a blessing on this union. By now, the shock had worn off for the rest of the head table, and the opportunism had set in. Patricia, recovering from her earlier stumble with me, realized that the most powerful man in Chicago was standing in the middle of her daughter's wedding. Her eyes lit up with the brightness of 1,000 dying stars. She saw dollar signs. She saw social status. She saw a way to bury the awkwardness of the last 5 minutes. She grabbed Isabella's hand and practically dragged the bride down the stairs. "Mason!" she trilled, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness as she pushed her way into the circle. "Introduce us to your distinguished guests." Mason turned, eager to show off. Yes, Mr. Sterling, Mrs. Sterling, please meet my new family. This is my mother-in-law, Patricia Whitlock, and my beautiful bride, Isabella." Patricia extended her hand to Eleanor, performing a curtsy that was so archaic and unnecessary it was painful to watch. "Mrs. Sterling," she gushed. "Oh, I have read so much about your charity work. It is an absolute privilege to have you grace us with your presence. I must say, Mason told us he had high connections, but we had no idea he was moving in such celestial circles." Eleanor took Patricia's hand briefly, her touch light and dismissive. "Thank you, Mrs. Whitlock. It is certainly a memorable event." Isabella, sensing the power dynamic, stepped forward. She batted her eyelashes, flashing the smile she usually reserved for wealthy suitors. "Thank you for coming. We have a special table reserved right next to the dais. The VIP table. Please, let us escort you." The entire room was watching. Phones were out now, recording. The guests were buzzing. The narrative had shifted. Mason wasn't just a guy with a startup. He was a guy who could summon Richard Sterling, in the eyes of the guests. Mason's stock had just skyrocketed. Even the cousins who had been whispering about his debts looked impressed. Mason was soaking it up. He looked around the room, puffing out his chest. "See?" His expression said, "I am important." But Richard Sterling was not moving toward the VIP table. He was standing perfectly still, his hands clasped behind his back, his eyes scanning the room. He looked over Mason's head. He looked over Patricia's sequined shoulder. He was like a lighthouse beam cutting through the fog, searching for a specific point on the horizon. "Is everything all right, sir?" Mason asked, sensing the hesitation. "Can I get you a drink? Champagne? We have the Dom Perignon chilling for the toast." Richard ignored the offer. He turned his gaze slowly, deliberately, scanning the tables. He looked at the front row. He looked at the middle section. "I am not here for the champagne, Mr. Rutherford," Richard said, his tone cool and detached, "and while your invitation was persistent, I must admit, my wife and I are here primarily to pay our respects to a very specific individual." Mason blinked. "Of course, me, the groom." Richard's eyebrow arched a fraction of an inch, a gesture that, in the boardroom, usually preceded a CEO getting fired. "Not exactly," Richard said dryly. Patricia jumped in, desperate to keep the momentum going. "Oh, you must mean Isabella." "Of course, everyone is here for the bride. She is the jewel of the evening, isn't she?" Eleanor chuckled softly. It was a sound like wind chimes, beautiful, but with a cold edge. "A jewel? Perhaps, but we are looking for the artist who polished it." Mason looked confused. "The artist? You mean the photographer? He is over there by the cake." Richard sighed. It was a short, impatient sound. He stopped scanning the room and looked directly at Mason. "I am looking for my art director." "Mason," the words hung in the air. Mason froze. His smile faltered, twitching at the corners. "I am sorry? Your art director?" "Yes," Richard continued, his voice hardening slightly. "The senior art director of Aurora Zenith. The woman responsible for the visual identity of my entire corporation. The woman who manages a budget larger than the valuation of your entire company. She told me she would be here. The room went dead silent again. The guests were leaning in, trying to catch every word. Mason laughed nervously, looking around as if Richard had told a joke he did not quite understand. "Sir, I think there has been a mistake. We do not have any executives here. This is a family wedding. It is just friends and family. My college buddies, my parents, and the Whitlocks." Patricia nodded vigorously. "Yes, Mr. Sterling, just us. We do not know any art directors. Unless you mean Cousin Joey? He draws comic books." She pointed to Joey at table 19, who turned bright red and slid down in his chair. Richard ignored her. He looked at Mason with a mixture of pity and disbelief. "You do not know?" Richard asked quietly. "Know what?" Mason asked, sweat starting to bead on his forehead. Richard turned to Eleanor. "He does not know." Eleanor shook her head, adjusting her shawl. "It is remarkable, isn't it? To be so blind to the gold in your own backyard." Mason was starting to panic. The script was going off the rails. He was supposed to be the hero, the connector, the big man. Now he looked like a student who hadn't studied for the final exam. "Mr. Sterling, please," Mason pleaded, his voice dropping. "If one of your employees is crashing my wedding, I will have security remove them immediately. We cannot have uninvited guests bothering you. Just tell me who it is." Richard's eyes finally stopped scanning. They locked onto the far corner of the room. They locked onto the pillar wrapped in tulle. They locked onto the shadows where the audio technician was eating a bread roll. And they locked onto me. "Remove her?" Richard repeated, his voice dangerously low. "You want to remove the woman who holds the deciding vote on your Series B funding?" Mason's face went white, like a sheet of paper white. "Funding? Wait, the acquisition deal?" Richard nodded. "The creative review? The final hurdle. The person I trust implicitly to tell me if a company has the soul and the integrity to be part of Aurora Zenith." Richard took a step forward, moving away from Mason, moving away from Isabella and Patricia. He began to walk through the crowd. The guests parted for him like the Red Sea. Patricia looked frantic. Where is he going? Who is he looking for? Mason grabbed Isabella's arm. "Who did you invite? Did you invite someone from Aurora Zenith? Why didn't you tell me?" "I didn't," Isabella hissed, pulling away. "Just family. And Helen. That is it." Richard kept walking. He walked past the bankers. He walked past the college friends. He walked past the aunts who had whispered about my dress. He walked straight toward the back of the room. Eleanor followed him, a serene smile on her face. Mason and the Whitlocks trailed behind them like confused puppies, stumbling over each other to keep up. "Mr. Sterling," Mason called out, "you are going toward the service area. There is nothing back there. Just the kitchen and the sound guys." Richard ignored him. He reached table 19. He stopped. The entire room turned. 300 people craned their necks to see who the great Richard Sterling was standing in front of. They saw the wobbly table. They saw the audio technician wiping crumbs off his shirt. They saw the confused elderly couple. And they saw me. I was sitting perfectly still, my hands resting on the tablecloth, my expression unchanged. I looked up at Richard. "Hello?" "Richard," I said calmly, "you are late." The gasp that went through the room sucked the oxygen right out of the air. Mason skidded to a halt behind Richard. He looked at Richard. He looked at me. He looked back at Richard. "Her?" Mason choked out, pointing a shaking finger at me. "Helen?" Patricia pushed her way to the front, her face a mask of horror. "Mr. Sterling, please, you must be mistaken. This is just Helen, my daughter. She is unemployed. She does freelance work. She is nobody." Richard turned slowly to face Patricia. The look on his face was enough to freeze magma. "Nobody?" Richard repeated, his voice icy. He reached out a hand toward me. I took it. He helped me stand up. I smoothed the silk of my midnight blue dress. I stood tall, my heels adding 3 inches to my height, bringing me eye to eye with Mason. "Patricia, Richard said, his voice ringing with authority. You might want to rephrase that, because the woman you just called nobody is the only reason I'm standing in this room. Mason looked like he was having a stroke. Helen? He whispered. You? You are the art director? I smiled. It was the first real smile I had allowed myself all night. Hello. Mason, I said softly. I did tell you I worked in design. You just never asked where. The silence that followed was heavy, absolute, and delicious. It was the sound of a house of cards collapsing, one floor at a time. The atmosphere in the ballroom had shifted from a festive celebration to the sharp, brittle tension of a courtroom right before the verdict is read. My mother, Patricia, stood frozen, her hand still extended halfway toward Eleanor Sterling, a gesture of social climbing that had been brutally interrupted by reality. She looked at Richard, then at me, her mind clearly struggling to process the information that did not fit into the carefully constructed diorama of her life. Excuse me, Patricia stammered, her voice pitching up into a register that only dogs could fully appreciate. There must be a misunderstanding. Helen is well. Helen is just Helen. She draws pictures. She lives in a studio. She cannot be. She tried to step between us, a physical barrier to block the truth from contaminating her perfect event. She actually reached out to touch Eleanor's arm, a frantic attempt to reclaim the attention of the billionaire for herself. Mrs. Sterling, please, let us go to the VIP table, Patricia insisted, her desperation leaking out like oil from a cracked engine. The lighting here is terrible. You cannot possibly want to stand near the kitchen. Eleanor Sterling did not shout. She did not make a scene. She simply looked at Patricia's hand on her sleeve with the same expression one might reserve for a smudge of dirt on a pristine window. She moved her arm, a subtle, fluid motion that dislodged my mother's grip without even appearing aggressive. It was a masterclass in aristocratic dismissal. Mrs. Whitlock, Eleanor said, her voice cool and carrying the weight of absolute authority. I suggest you step back. You are blocking my view of the most important person in this room. Patricia stumbled back as if she had been shoved, though Eleanor had barely touched her. She collided with a waiter holding a tray of champagne, sending the glasses rattling. Eleanor turned her back on my mother completely. She walked the final 2 steps to table 19, ignoring the stunned audio technician and the gaping cousin. She opened her arms. Helen. My love, Eleanor said, her voice projecting clearly to the back of the room, warm and rich with an affection that my biological mother had never once offered me. I stepped into her embrace. It smelled of lavender and old money. I let my guard down for the fraction of a second, resting my head against her shoulder. It was the hug of a mother who actually saw her child. Why are you sitting in the dark? Eleanor asked, pulling back to cup my face in her hands. Her rings cool against my skin. You are the heart of Aurora Zenith. Helen, we do not put our diamonds in the basement. I smiled, and for the first time that night, it reached my eyes. I am just following instructions. Eleanor, I was told to sit where I would not embarrass the family. Richard Sterling stepped up beside us. He placed a heavy, reassuring hand on my shoulder. He looked at me with a mixture of pride and protective fury. I told you to take the car with us, daughter, Richard said. The word hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. He used it deliberately. He knew exactly what it would do. I know, Richard, I replied softly, but I wanted to see the show. The word daughter hit the room like a physical blow. I heard the collective intake of breath from 300 guests. Mason Rutherford was standing 3 feet away. He looked like a man who had just watched his entire life savings burn in a bonfire. His face was a mask of gray shock. He looked from Richard to me, his eyes darting back and forth as he tried to solve an equation that made no sense to him. Daughter? Mason whispered, the words scraping out of his throat. But she is a Whitlock. You are the Sterlings. Richard turned his gaze on Mason. It was not a kind look. It was the look he gave CEOs right before he dismantled their companies and sold off the parts. Family is not just blood, Mr. Rutherford, Richard said coldly. It is loyalty. It is talent. It is shared values. Helen has been more of a daughter to us for the past 10 years than anyone of her own blood seems to have been. Mason swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing convulsively. But you said art director? The senior art director? He looked at me, really looked at me, for the first time. He saw the Milanese silk of my dress not as a drab rag, but as the quiet luxury it was. He saw the way I stood next to the billionaire titans of industry, not as a subordinate, but as an equal. Helen? Mason stammered, taking a step toward me, his hands shaking. You are the one? You are the executive Richard was talking about? I looked him in the eye. My expression was pleasant, professional, and utterly devoid of mercy. Hello, Mason, I said, my voice steady. I believe you have a file on your desk. The TechStream Series B funding application? You have been calling my office 3 times a day for a week. My secretary, Karen, says you are quite persistent. Mason's knees actually buckled. He grabbed the back of the audio technician's chair to steady himself. U.R.H. Whitlock? He gasped. The signature on the rejection memos, that is you? It is. I confirmed, but I thought Mason looked at Isabella, who was standing on the dais, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. I thought you were just a freelancer. Isabella said you designed logos for bake sales. Richard laughed. It was a dry, sharp bark of a laugh. Bake sales? Richard shook his head, looking at the crowd. Ladies and gentlemen, the woman standing before you is responsible for the entire visual strategy of a corporation valued at $40 billion. She does not design for bake sales. She designs the future of media. He turned back to Mason, his face hardening into stone, and more importantly, Mr. Rutherford, you seem to have missed a critical detail in your due diligence. Mason was sweating profusely now. His perfectly gelled hair was starting to wilt. What detail? Richard took a step closer to Mason, invading his personal space. Helen is not just an employee, Richard said, his voice lowering into a dangerous growl that the microphone still picked up perfectly. She is a partner. When I acquired the voting shares for the new venture capital arm, the specific arm you are begging for money from, I gave the controlling interest to her. Mason went pale. You mean, he whispered. Richard continued, driving the nail into the coffin, that Helen holds 40% of the voting rights on the investment board. I hold 30%. Eleanor holds 30%. Do the math. Son, Mason did the math. I could see the numbers crashing behind his eyes. Even if I wanted to give you that $200 million, Richard said, gesturing to me, I could not do it without her. She is the gatekeeper. She is the decision-maker. She is the one you have been ignoring, insulting, and hiding in the corner all night. The silence that followed was absolute. I watched the realization wash over Mason. It was a tidal wave of horror. He realized that every snide comment, every dismissal, every moment he had allowed his wife and mother-in-law to belittle me had been a nail in his own financial coffin. He had invited the executioner to his wedding and asked her to sit by the trash. Mason turned to Isabella, his face twisted with a sudden, ugly rage. You lied to me, he hissed, his voice audible to half the room. You told me she was a loser. You told me she was a nobody. Isabella stood on the stage, her bouquet drooping in her hand. She looked small. The spotlight that had been her ally was now her enemy, exposing every flaw in her terrified expression. I didn't know, Isabella cried out, her voice shrill. She never told us. Mom, do something. She turned to Patricia for help, but Patricia was beyond helping anyone. My mother was staring at me as if I were a stranger who had just spoken a foreign language. Her world, a world built on the foundation that she was the successful matriarch and I was the disappointment, had just shattered. She looked at the Sterlings, then at her own sequined dress, and realized how cheap she looked in comparison. Helen, Patricia whispered, her voice trembling. Is this true? You are rich? I laughed. It was a soft sound, but it carried, "It is not about the money, Mother." I said, "It never was. It is about the work. It is about the respect. Things you never understood." The guests were no longer whispering. They were staring, open-mouthed. The dynamic of the room had flipped so violently that I could almost feel the air pressure change. The looks of pity that had been directed at me were gone. In their place was awe, fear, and a burning curiosity. They looked at the Sterlings flanking me like royal guards. They looked at Mason, sweating and ruined. They looked at Patricia and Isabella, exposed as frauds. A woman at a nearby table, one of the aunts who had called me poor earlier, leaned forward, her eyes wide. "Did he say 40%? She whispered to her husband. 40% of the voting rights? That means she is worth millions, tens of millions," her husband corrected, looking at me with newfound reverence. "Maybe more. And they put her at the sound table?" The murmur spread. They put her at the sound table. It became a chant of condemnation. The crowd turned on the host. The herd mentality shifted. They realized they had backed the wrong horse. They had laughed at the woman who could buy and sell them all. I felt a hand on my arm. It was Richard. "Come, Helen," he said gently. "The air back here is stale. Let us go to the center, where you belong." I nodded. I stepped away from table 19. I stepped away from the flickering candle and the wobbly chair. I stepped away from the identity of the failure that my family had forced me to wear for 29 years. I walked between Richard and Eleanor. We moved toward the center of the room, toward the dance floor, toward the light. Mason had to step out of our way. He practically jumped aside, terrified to even brush against my dress. He looked like a man facing a firing squad. "Helen," he called out as I passed him. "Helen, wait. We can talk about this. We can fix this. It was just a misunderstanding. I didn't know." I did not stop. I did not look at him. I kept my eyes fixed on the horizon, on the exit, on the future. Patricia tried to grab my hand as I passed the dais. "Helen, please, don't do this to your sister. Not today." I paused for a fraction of a second. I looked at my mother's hand, the hand that had pushed me away 1,000 times, reaching for me now only because I had value. I sidestepped her touch. I continued walking. As we reached the center of the ballroom, directly in front of the head table, the contrast was stark. On the stage stood the bride and her mother, decked in white and gold, yet looking cheap, desperate, and small. On the floor stood me, in dark navy, flanked by the true titans, radiating a power that no amount of sequins could fake. The guests began to stand. It wasn't a planned ovation. It was instinct. They stood to get a better look. They stood because power demands respect. I stopped in the center of the room. I turned slowly to face the head table. The room waited. Mason waited. Isabella waited. I took a deep breath. The air tasted sweet. It tasted like justice. I looked at the bride who had spent her life stealing my light, the bride who was now realizing that she had married a man who was only chasing a fortune she didn't have, while the sister she despised held the fortune he needed. It was the perfect trap, and they had built it themselves. The distance between the polished parquet floor where I stood and the raised dais where my family huddled was less than 10 feet, yet it felt like the distance between two distinct realities. In one reality, the one I had just stepped out of, I was the discarded spare, the shadow to Isabella's light. In the new reality, the one Richard Sterling had just violently birthed with a few sentences, I was the sun, and they were staring at me with retinas burned by the glare. I did not need to shout. I did not need to climb onto the stage and shake them. The silence in the room was my amplifier. It was heavy, thick, and suffocating. It pressed against Mason's chest, making him struggle for breath. It wrapped around Isabella's throat, turning her triumphant smile into a rictus of confusion. I stood with my hands clasped loosely in front of me, flanked by Richard and Eleanor. I looked up at them. For years, I had looked up at them from a place of subservience. Now, I looked up at them only because they were standing on a stage that was rapidly crumbling beneath their feet. Mason was the first to break. The realization of what Richard's words meant had finally percolated through the layers of his narcissism and hit the bedrock of his financial desperation. He looked at me, the woman he had dismissed as unimportant less than an hour ago, and then he whipped his head around to look at his bride. The look on his face was not love, it was not adoration, it was the feral, panicked look of a man who realizes he has bet his life savings on a horse that died in the starting gate. "You told me she was a loser," Mason hissed. His voice was not a whisper. In the acoustic perfection of the ballroom, it carried to the back rows. Isabella blinked, recoiling as if he had slapped her. "Mason? You told me she was unemployed." Mason's voice rose, cracking with hysteria. He took a step away from her, his hands balling into fists at his sides. "You said she was a freelance nobody. You said she was the black sheep who borrowed money from your parents," Isabella stammered, clutching her bouquet so tightly the stems snapped. "I didn't lie. That is what she is. She lives in a studio apartment. She never talks about work. How was I supposed to know?" "How were you supposed to know?" Mason shouted. Abandoning all pretense of decorum, "She is your sister. You mean to tell me you have a sister who runs the biggest media conglomerate in the Midwest? A sister who holds the keys to the vault I have been trying to unlock for 6 months, and you treated her like the help?" He turned to the crowd, throwing his arms out in a gesture of disbelief. "I have been emailing her office for weeks. I have been begging for a meeting. And she was sitting right there, at table 19. He spun back to Isabella, his face twisting into a sneer of pure disgust. "You paraded her around like a prop to make yourself look better. You laughed at her. You made me laugh at her. Do you have any idea what you have done? You have humiliated the one person who could have saved me." Isabella's face crumbled. She was not used to being the villain. She was the princess. She was the protagonist. The script was not supposed to go this way. She looked at the guests, seeking sympathy, but found only cold, judgmental stares. The herd had turned. They saw a screeching groom and a lying bride, and they were eating it up. She turned to her mother, her eyes wide and wet. "Mom, tell him. Tell him we didn't know." Patricia stepped forward, her hands fluttering nervously near her throat. She looked at Mason, then at Richard, her eyes pleading. "Mason, sweetheart, please calm down," she said, her voice trembling. "It is just a misunderstanding. Helen is very secretive. She likes to play games. We just thought—" "You thought what?" Mason cut her off, his voice dripping with venom. "You thought you could trick me? You sold me this image of a perfect, wealthy family. You acted like you were royalty and she was the peasant. But it is the other way around, isn't it?" He laughed, a harsh barking sound. "I married the wrong sister," he muttered, loud enough for everyone to hear. The air left the room. Isabella let out a small, strangled gasp. It was the sound of a heart breaking, not out of lost love, but out of lost status. She looked at Mason, the man she had just vowed to love and cherish, and saw only regret. Then, she looked at me. Her eyes were filled with a toxic mixture of jealousy, rage, and confusion. She stepped to the edge of the dais, looking down at me. She wanted to scream. She wanted to call me names. She wanted to use the old weapons, the insults about my looks, my personality, my solitude, but the weapons were useless. I stepped forward, moving out from between the Sterlings. I stood alone in the center of the floor, looking up at her. "Isabella," I said. My voice was calm. It was the voice I used in boardrooms when I was dismantling a weak argument. It was smooth, low, and terrifyingly steady. "You asked me to come early to fix the flowers because you said I was good with my hands." I continued. "You asked me to sit in the back because you said I would ruin the pictures. You asked me to come alone because you said I had no one." I paused, letting the words hang in the air. "I did everything you asked. I fixed the flowers. I sat in the dark. I came alone." I took a slow breath, locking eyes with her. "But you made one mistake. You confused silence with emptiness. You confused solitude with weakness." I gestured to the room, to the waiters frozen with their trays, to the guests watching with bated breath, to the Sterlings standing like sentinels behind me. I came alone, Isabella, just as Mother wanted, but I am not lonely. I have built a life that you cannot even comprehend. I have built a career that commands respect from men like your husband. I shifted my gaze to Mason, who flinched under my scrutiny. I own my name. I said, I own my reputation. And as of this morning, when Richard transferred the voting rights to my portfolio, I effectively own the future of the company your husband is trying to build. Isabella opened her mouth. Her lips parted. I could see the muscles in her neck straining. She wanted to launch a retort. She wanted to say, "You are lying," or "I hate you," or "You are just jealous." She wanted to reclaim the spotlight. She wanted to be the victim, but she looked at the crowd. She saw the way they were looking at me, with awe, with respect, with fear. Then she looked at Mason. She saw him looking at me with desperation. And finally, she looked at herself in the reflection of the glass doors behind the dais. She saw a woman in a white dress that suddenly looked like a costume. She saw a woman who had spent 27 years bullying a sister who had outgrown her in every conceivable way. The words died in her throat. Her mouth worked silently, opening and closing like a marionette with cut strings. A flush of red crept up her neck, staining her face. The realization was a physical weight, crushing her lungs. She wasn't the star. She wasn't the winner. She was the punchline. She tried to force a sound out, a screech of indignation, but all that came out was a dry, pathetic squeak. The bride couldn't speak. Her knees gave way. It wasn't a theatrical faint. It was a collapse of structural integrity. She sank down onto the chair behind her, the layers of tulle puffing out around her like a collapsing meringue. She stared at me, her eyes wide and vacant, stripped of all her power. The silence stretched out, agonizing and absolute. Then, Patricia tried to fill it. My mother, unable to stand the vacuum of power, stepped in front of her defeated daughter. She forced a smile onto her face. It was a grotesque expression, twitching at the corners. "Helen," she chirped, her voice high and brittle. "Oh, Helen, stop it. You are taking this too seriously." She waved her hand dismissively, as if swatting away a fly. "We were just having a little fun. You know how we are. It is just family banter. We tease because we love." She looked around the room, seeking validation from the guests. Right? Everyone knows the Whitlocks have a dry sense of humor. We were just playing a part. We knew Helen was successful all along. We were just trying to keep her humble. She laughed. It was the same laugh from earlier, but now it sounded thin and terrified. "Come on up here. Helen," she beckoned, patting the empty space next to Isabella. "Come give your sister a hug. We are family, and family forgives everything, especially on a wedding day. You wouldn't ruin your sister's wedding over a few silly jokes, would you?" I looked at my mother. I looked at the woman who had refused to pay for my college tuition, but had bought Isabella a trip to Europe. I looked at the woman who had laughed when I arrived alone. I did not have to answer her. Eleanor Sterling stepped forward. Her heels clicked sharply on the dance floor. She moved past me, placing herself between me and the stage. She did not look like a philanthropist in that moment. She looked like a lioness protecting her cub. "Family?" Eleanor asked. The word cracked like a whip. Patricia froze. Yes, Mrs. Sterling. We are her mother and sister." Eleanor shook her head slowly. Her expression was one of profound disappointment. "I have watched Helen for 10 years, Eleanor said, her voice clear and resonant. "I have watched her work through holidays because she had nowhere else to go. I have watched her spend Christmas in my guest room because you didn't call her. I have watched her build herself up from nothing, from the nothing you left her with." Eleanor took a step closer to the stage, looking up at Patricia with eyes that were cold and hard. Family does not make their daughters sit in the dark near the kitchen doors. Eleanor stated, "Family does not announce to a room full of strangers that their child is a charity case. Family do not laugh when their child is alone." Patricia shrank back, clutching her necklace. We just thought— You thought she was weak. Eleanor cut her off. You thought she was small. You thought you could use her as a stepping stone for your other daughter's vanity. Eleanor reached back and took my hand, pulling me forward until I was standing side by side with her. You were wrong, Eleanor said. And frankly, Mrs. Whitlock, looking at the way you treat your own flesh and blood, you do not deserve Helen. You never did. Mason let out a groan, burying his face in his hands. He knew it was over. The bridge wasn't just burned, it was nuked. Isabella sat in her chair, tears finally streaming down her face, ruining her makeup. She still couldn't speak. She just shook her head, looking at her lap, unable to face the reality of what she had lost. I squeezed Eleanor's hand. It was an anchor. I looked at my biological family one last time. They were a tableau of ruin, a greedy groom, a silenced bride, and a desperate mother. I felt a strange sensation in my chest. It wasn't anger anymore. It wasn't even sadness. It was lightness. The heavy coat of their expectations and their cruelty had slipped off my shoulders. I turned to Richard. I think I have seen enough. Richard, I said quietly. Richard nodded, offering me his arm. I think you are right, my dear, he said. Let us go get some dinner. I know a place that serves wine that does not taste like vinegar. He turned his back on Mason Rutherford without a second glance. I took his arm. Eleanor took my other hand. We turned around, presenting our backs to the stage. We began to walk toward the exit. Behind us, the room erupted into chaos. The murmur of the crowd rose into a roar. I heard Mason start shouting at Isabella again. I heard Patricia screeching at Mason to stop. I heard the sound of a glass breaking, but I did not look back. I walked toward the doors, my head held high, leaving the silence of the bride and the ruins of the Whitlock family fading into the background noise of my past. The exit doors loomed ahead, framing the night sky, promising fresh air and a freedom I had finally earned. The squeak of patent leather shoes skidding on the polished parquet floor was the only warning I got before Mason Rutherford threw himself into my path. We had not even made it to the exit. The desperation radiating off him was so potent it almost had a smell, acrid, sour, and pitiful. He did not look at his wife, who was currently dissolving into a puddle of tulle and humiliation on the stage. He did not look at his mother-in-law, who was frantically signaling the band to play something, anything, to drown out the disaster. He only had eyes for me, or more accurately, he had eyes for the 40% voting stake I held in the venture capital firm that was currently his only lifeline. Helen, please. Mason gasped, blocking our way. He held his hands up in a gesture of surrender, his chest heaving. We need to talk. Just for a minute. Just a professional courtesy. Richard Sterling stepped forward, his body angling to shield me, but I placed a hand on his arm. I did not need protection from Mason Rutherford. A lion does not need protection from a rat. It only needs to decide whether to eat it or ignore it. I motioned for Richard to step back. I looked at Mason. You have 30 seconds. Mason, I said. My voice was devoid of warmth. It was the voice I used when firing incompetent staff. Mason swallowed hard, wiping sweat from his upper lip. Look, Helen Ms. Whitlock. I know we got off on the wrong foot. I know my behavior earlier was regrettable, but you have to understand the pressure I'm under. This wedding, the investors, the market volatility. I was stressed. He laughed nervously, a sound that cracked in the middle. I didn't know who you were. He continued, his eyes pleading. If I had known you were the Helen Whitlock, the genius behind the rebranding of Aurora Zenith, things would have been different. I would have seated you at the head table. I would have— He trailed off, realizing that his defense was actually an admission of guilt. You would have what? I asked, tilting my head slightly. You would have treated me with basic human decency? But only if you knew I was rich? Only if you knew I could do something for you? No, that is not what I mean, Mason stammered, looking around at the guests who were now standing on their chairs to get a better view. I mean, we are family now, right? You are my sister-in-law. We should support each other. TechStream has incredible potential. Helen, you saw the algorithm. You know the numbers. Do not let a personal family squabble get in the way of a $200 million opportunity. It is just business. He extended a hand toward me, a smile trembling on his lips. It was the smile of a salesman trying to close a deal while the building burned down around him. Let us start over, he said. Hi, I am Mason. It is an honor to meet you. I looked at his hand. It was manicured. It was shaking. I did not take it. I looked him in the eye, and I let the silence stretch until it was agonizing. Mason, I said softly, you are right about one thing. I have seen the algorithm. I have analyzed the numbers for TechStream. Hope flared in his eyes, and he breathed, and the finances are shaky. I said, my voice clinical and precise. Your burn rate is too high. Your user acquisition cost is unsustainable. But those are things we can fix with capital and management. Mason exhaled, his shoulders sagging in relief. Exactly. We just need the capital. However, I continued, raising my voice slightly so it carried to the witnesses standing nearby. Aurora Zenith operates on a standard that goes beyond spreadsheets. We invest in leadership. We invest in character. We invest in integrity. I took a step closer to him. When I review a founder, I look at how they treat the people they think can do nothing for them. I look at how they treat the waiters, the drivers, and the poor relations sitting in the dark at table 19. Mason's face went pale again. You failed that test. Mason, I said, you failed it spectacularly. You are a man who bends with the wind of social status. You are a man who humiliates his own family to impress strangers. And a man like that cannot be trusted with $200 million of our shareholders' money. I turned to Richard. Richard, record my official vote. Richard nodded solemnly. Recorded. I turned back to Mason. The application for TechStream Solutions for Series B funding is denied. I declared, Aurora Zenith will not be investing. And since we are the lead investors, I imagine the other firms will withdraw their offers by tomorrow morning when the news breaks. Mason stood there, frozen. It was as if I had physically struck him. The color drained from his face, leaving it a sickly gray. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. The reality of his situation crashed down on him. Without the funding, his company was dead. His debt would consume him. He was not just rejected, he was bankrupt. Then, the shock turned to rage. It was an ugly, primal transformation. His face twisted. He spun around, looking for a target, looking for someone to blame for the destruction of his life. He saw Isabella. She was still sitting on the dais, staring at her lap, defeated. Mason charged back toward the stage. The guests parted for him, terrified by the look in his eyes. "This is your fault!" Mason screamed. He didn't care about the cameras anymore. He didn't care about the image. You and your toxic, lying mother," Mason bellowed, pointing a shaking finger at Isabella. "You told me she was trash. You told me she was nothing." Isabella flinched, shrinking back into her chair. "Mason, please, you set me up," Mason roared, grabbing a glass of champagne from a passing waiter's tray and hurling it at the floor. It shattered, sending shards of crystal and expensive wine flying across the white dance floor. "You ruined me. I married you because I thought you came from a good family. I thought you had class. But you are just a fraud wrapped in a Vera Wang dress." The guests gasped. Phones were out everywhere now. The red recording lights were like hundreds of tiny, accusatory eyes. This wasn't just a wedding disaster. This was viral content. This was the end of the Rutherford and Whitlock social standing in Newport forever. Mason turned to Patricia, who was standing by the cake, clutching her pearls. "And you," Mason shouted, advancing on her, "you old hag, you orchestrated this. Keep Helen in the back. You said, don't let her talk to anyone. You said, you cost me $200 million because you were too petty to treat your own daughter with respect." Patricia shrieked as Mason kicked over a floral arrangement. The vase smashed, spilling water and white roses over the hem of her gold dress. "Get out!" Mason screamed at both of them. "Get out of my wedding! Get out of my life. I am calling my lawyers. I am getting an annulment. It was chaos. Absolute, unadulterated chaos. The string quartet, bless their hearts, had stopped playing. A baby was crying somewhere in the back. Waiters were backing away, trying to save the hors d'oeuvres. I watched it all from the center of the room. It was a tragedy, yes, but it was a tragedy of their own making. They were cannibals who had finally run out of other people to eat, so they were turning on each other, Patricia, realizing that her son-in-law was lost, that the money was gone, and that her social standing was evaporating. Did the only thing she knew how to do. She looked for a life raft. She saw me standing near the exit with the Sterlings, the only people in the room who looked calm, powerful, and untouched by the grime. "Helen!" Patricia cried out. She ran toward me. She actually ran, hitching up her sequined gown, stumbling in her heels. She pushed past a waiter. She pushed past a cousin. She reached me, breathless and frantic, tears streaming down her face, ruining her mascara. She grabbed my hand. Her grip was wet and clammy. "Helen, baby, please," Patricia sobbed, her voice hysterical. "You have to stop him. You have to fix this. Talk to him. Give him the money." I looked down at her hand on mine. It was the hand that used to slap my wrist when I reached for a second helping of dinner. It was the hand that had signed the check for Isabella's Europe trip while I worked the night shift. "Mother," I said, my voice cool, "I cannot fix a bad investment, but he is family," Patricia wailed, clinging to me. "We are your family. You cannot let us be ruined like this. Look at your sister. Look at what he is doing to her." She gestured to the stage, where Isabella was sobbing into her hands while Mason screamed into his phone, presumably calling his lawyer. "You have the power." "Helen," Patricia begged, "you are rich. You are successful. You can save us. Please, for the sake of the blood we share. Don't you love us?" I looked at her. I looked deep into her eyes, searching for even a speck of genuine affection. I looked for the mother who should have been there when I fell off my bike, when I got accepted to college, when I was in the hospital. I found nothing. I saw only fear and greed. She didn't want me. She wanted my checkbook. She wanted my protection. I slowly, deliberately, used my other hand to pry her fingers off my arm. One by one, I stepped back, creating a physical chasm between us that was impossible to bridge. I looked at the weeping woman who had given birth to me. "Mother," I said, and my voice was soft, but in the silence of the room, it hit with the force of a sledgehammer. "You laughed when I walked in here alone." Patricia's mouth opened, but no sound came out. She remembered. Everyone remembered. "You laughed." I repeated. "You made a joke of my solitude. You mocked my life. You thought it was funny that I had no one." I gestured to Richard and Eleanor, who stood beside me, solid and unwavering. "You thought I was alone," I said, "but I wasn't. And now?" I looked at Mason, screaming in the background. I looked at Isabella, broken on the stage. I looked back at Patricia. "Now you are the one who is crying, and I am the one leaving." I paused, delivering the final verdict, and unlike you, "Mother, I am leaving with my real family." I turned my back on her. There was no hesitation this time, no lingering look. I felt Richard's hand on my back, guiding me. I felt Eleanor's arm link through mine. We walked toward the doors. Behind me, I heard Patricia scream my name one last time. It was a sound of pure despair, the sound of a woman realizing she had thrown away a diamond to hoard broken glass. "Helen!" I kept walking. We passed the guests who were now silent, filming the exit of the woman they had pitied. I saw the flash of cameras. I saw the awe on their faces. We stepped out of the ballroom and into the cool night air of Newport. The doors swung shut behind us, muffling the sounds of the screaming groom and the wailing mother. I took a deep breath. The air smelled of the ocean and rain. It smelled clean. I did not look back at the stage. I did not check on Isabella. She sat there, a queen of ashes, her makeup running down her face in dark streaks. her white dress billowing around her like a shroud. She had not spoken a word since I confronted her. She had been rendered mute by the weight of her own cruelty returning to crush her. The bride couldn't speak, and honestly, there was nothing left for her to say. The heavy oak doors of the Sapphire Cliffs Resort swung shut behind us, cutting off the cacophony of the ballroom as effectively as a guillotine blade. One moment, the air was filled with the sounds of a screaming groom, a wailing mother, and the frantic murmurs of 300 scandalized guests. The next, there was only the rhythmic, soothing crash of the Atlantic Ocean against the cliffs below and the chirping of crickets in the manicured hedges. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the cool, salty night air. It tasted different than the air inside. It tasted clean. It tasted like oxygen. Not perfume and desperation. For the first time in 29 years, the invisible corset that had constricted my breathing, the tightness in my chest born of trying to be small enough to fit into my family's narrow expectations, snapped open. "Are you all right?" "Helen?" Eleanor asked, her voice soft in the darkness. I turned to look at her. The moonlight caught the silver in her hair and the diamonds at her throat. She looked tired, but triumphant. "I am more than all right," I said, and I was surprised to find that I meant it. I feel light. Is it terrible to say that I feel lighter than I have ever felt in my life? Richard chuckled, stepping up to the valet stand and handing his ticket to a young man who looked relieved to be escaping the drama inside. "It is not terrible at all," Richard said. "It is called freedom, and it is long overdue." We did not say another word until the valet brought my car and Richard's limousine. There was no need for discussion. The events inside spoke for themselves. The bridge back to the Whitlocks had not just been burned, it had been detonated, the rubble swept away by the tide. "We are not going home yet," Richard announced as he opened the car door for Eleanor. "I am starving. All that shouting made me hungry, and I refused to eat the rubber chicken Mason Rutherford paid for." I smiled. "The Italian place?" "The Italian place," Richard confirmed with a wink. We drove in a convoy, leaving the grand, oppressive resort behind. We wound our way down the coastal roads, away from the mansions and the pretension, toward the heart of the town. We pulled up in front of Luigi's, a small, unassuming bistro with red-checkered tablecloths and the smell of garlic and roasted tomatoes wafting out into the street. This was our place. It was the restaurant Eleanor had brought me to 10 years ago. On that very first evening after she found me shelving books in the library, I had been a starving student with holes in my shoes, and she had watched me eat 3 bowls of pasta with a mixture of amusement and maternal concern. That night, over plates of carbonara, we had forged a bond that was stronger than genetics. We walked in, and the owner, a boisterous man named Marco, greeted us like returning heroes. He did not know we were billionaires or corporate executives. He just knew we liked his lasagna. We sat in a booth in the back, far away from the world of high-stakes mergers and social climbing. We ordered a bottle of Chianti and enough food to feed an army. When the wine arrived, Richard poured 3 glasses. He raised him. "To freedom," he said simply. "To family," Eleanor added, clinking her glass against mine. "To the truth?" I whispered. We drank. The wine was robust and earthy, a stark contrast to the thin, acidic vinegar Mason had served. We ate, we laughed, but this laughter was different. It wasn't the cruel, mocking laughter of my mother. It wasn't the nervous, sycophantic laughter of Mason. It was deep, belly-shaking laughter that came from a place of genuine joy. We laughed about the look on the audio technician's face. We laughed about Mason's sprint down the aisle. We laughed because the alternative was to cry over the wasted years, and tonight was not a night for tears. As we ate, my phone began to buzz. It vibrated against the wood of the table, a relentless, angry insect. I glanced at the screen. It was a notification from a social media app, then another, then a text from a cousin I hadn't spoken to in 5 years, then a news alert. I picked up the phone. "Don't," Eleanor warned gently. "You do not need to let them in here. I just want to see," I said. I unlock the screen. The algorithm works fast, but the internet works faster. A video had been uploaded to a popular video sharing platform 20 minutes ago. The title was simple and brutal: Groom Meltdown at Newport Wedding, Screams at Bride and Mom. I clicked play. The video was shaky, clearly filmed by a guest hiding their phone under a napkin. It showed Mason, his face purple with rage, screaming at Isabella and Patricia. It captured every word of his tirade about the money, the fraud, and the old hag. It captured Patricia wailing and kicking over the flowers. It captured Isabella sobbing on the stage, looking like a broken doll. The video already had 50,000 views. The comments were scrolling by so fast I could barely read them. Wow. Talk about a red flag. Run, girl. Wait, did he say he only married her for the money? Who is the sister he is talking about? The rich one? That mom is toxic. You can see it in her eyes. Karma is a boomerang, and it just hit that family in the face. I scrolled down. Another video. This one was titled, "The Mystery Woman in Navy Blue Owns the Room." It was a clip of me standing in the center of the floor, calm and collected, telling Mason he had failed the test. The comments on that one were different. Queen energy. That is how you handle a bully. I want to be her when I grow up. Does anyone know who she is? She looks like Helen Whitlock from Aurora Zenith. The secret was out. My anonymity, the shield I had worn for so long, was gone. But strangely, I didn't feel exposed. I felt validated. The world was seeing the truth. They were seeing the Whitlocks not as the victims of a cruel daughter, but as the architects of their own destruction. I looked at the missed calls. 7 from Patricia, 12 from Isabella, 3 from Mason. They were calling the lifeboat after they had already poked holes in it. I did not feel a surge of satisfaction. I did not feel the urge to answer and gloat. I felt a profound, quiet indifference. They were strangers to me now. They were characters in a book I had finished reading. I went to the settings menu on my phone. I selected Patricia's contact, block caller. I selected Isabella's contact, block caller. I selected Mason's contact, block caller. I did it without malice. I did it with the same emotional detachment one uses when taking out the trash. It was simply a necessary act of hygiene. I was cleaning my house. I put the phone face down on the table. "Done?" Richard asked, raising an eyebrow. "Done," I said. I took a bite of my tiramisu. It was sweet, creamy, and perfect. The next few days passed in a blur of activity, but it was the good kind of busy. The story of the disaster wedding dominated the local news cycles and gossip blogs for 48 hours before being replaced by a celebrity scandal, as these things always are. But the damage to the Whitlock reputation was permanent. Mason's company, TechStream, collapsed within the week. Investors fled, terrified by the viral video of the CEO's instability. He filed for bankruptcy on a Tuesday. I heard through the grapevine that the annulment papers were filed on a Wednesday. Isabella moved back in with Patricia, and from what I gathered, the house was not a happy one. They were trapped together in a prison of mutual blame, forced to live with the consequences of their greed. But I was not looking back. I was looking forward. On Monday morning, I walked into the Aurora Zenith building. The lobby felt different. The security guards nodded with a new level of deference. The whispers in the elevator were not about my freelance work, but about the woman who had stared down a screaming groom without blinking. I walked into Richard's office. He was standing by the window, looking out at the Chicago skyline, just as I had done a week ago. "Helen," he said, turning around. "Have a seat." I sat in one of the leather armchairs. "The board met this morning," Richard said, getting straight to business. "We discussed the TechStream incident, or rather, we discussed your handling of it." I stiffened slightly. "Did I overstep?" "On the contrary," Richard smiled. "The board was impressed. You protected the firm's reputation and its capital from a volatile element. You showed decisiveness, integrity, and a terrifying amount of poise under pressure." He picked up a file from his desk and slid it across to me. "We think it is time to make it official. Helen, The title of Senior Art Director is no longer sufficient for the scope of your influence. I opened the file. The contract inside was thick. At the top, in bold letters, it read, Vice President of Creative Strategy and Brand Development. It came with a corner office on the 50th floor. It came with a salary that would make Mason Rutherford weep. It came with a seat on the executive board. I looked up at Richard. Are you sure? I asked. I have never been more sure of anything. Richard said, You built this. Helen, you earned this. Not because of who your family is, but because of who you are. I signed the contract. That evening, I returned to my penthouse. I walked into the bathroom and stood before the large vanity mirror. I wiped away the day's makeup, revealing the face beneath. I looked at myself, really looked at myself. For 29 years, I had looked in mirrors and searched for flaws. I had looked for the reasons why my mother didn't love me. I had looked for the difficult child, the unlucky sister, the failure. But tonight, that woman was gone. The woman staring back at me was strong. Her eyes were clear and steady. She was a vice president. She was a daughter, not of Patricia Whitlock, but of the family she had chosen and who had chosen her. She was a woman who had walked through the fire of rejection and come out made of steel. I realized then that the greatest revenge wasn't the bankruptcy of Mason's company or the humiliation of Isabella. The greatest revenge was my own happiness. It was the fact that I no longer needed their approval to breathe. I no longer needed their love to feel whole. Blood is a biological accident. It is just DNA. It creates relatives, but it does not create family. Family is earned. Family is the people who show up at the hospital when you are hurt. Family is the people who buy you dinner when you are starving. Family is the people who stand beside you when the world is screaming at you and tell you that you are right. I walked out to my balcony, pouring myself a glass of vintage champagne, the good stuff, the kind that tastes like stars. I looked out at the city lights of Chicago, twinkling like a carpet of diamonds. I raised my glass to the night sky, to Helen. I whispered to the wind, and then I smiled. It wasn't a polite smile. It wasn't a cold smile. It was a smile that started in my toes and warmed me all the way to my fingertips. It was the smile of a woman who was finally, irrevocably free. I took a sip, and the bubbles danced on my tongue. The future was wide open, and for the first time in my life, I couldn't wait to see what happened next. Thank you so much for listening to this story. Please comment below telling us where you are listening from to connect and share your thoughts. And I invite you to subscribe to the Blue Payback channel. Like the video, and support us further by hitting the hype button so this story and this video can be heard by more people.